Man, it feels like we're drowning in information these days.
It really does, yeah.
Trying to, stay on top of everything going on
Yeah.
without getting, like, totally overwhelmed is a challenge, isn't it?
Is.
And that's why we do these deep dives.
That's right.
For you, our listener, who wants to kind of, like, cut through the noise and figure out what's really going on.
Absolutely.
In each deep dive, we focus on, like, a specific set of sources and try to, extract like the most important bits of knowledge.
The nuggets.
Yeah, the nuggets.
The real insight.
The insight.
Yeah.
So think of it as like your own curated guide to like understanding these complex topics without having to spend hours and hours going through it all yourself.
Exactly, yeah.
So today our focus is on a recent episode of the Joe Rogan Experience, number 2299 with Dave Smith.
Okay.
You can find it on YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
And our mission here is to kind of like delve into their conversation and understand their perspectives on some of the, key events that are shaping our world right now.
Okay, sounds good.
We'll be looking at the nature of protests,
Right.
forces influencing political events, complexities of U.S. foreign policies,
Yeah.
the ever-shifting media landscape,
Sure.
all through like the lens of their discussion.
Okay.
And as always, we're going to present the different viewpoints that they raised in like an impartial way, reflecting what was shared in the source material.
Right, absolutely. Okay, so let's unpack this.
Okay, let's do it.
So one thing that really kind of jumped out at me
Yeah.
was their observation about some of the, like, seemingly contradictory protests that we've seen.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
They talked about that image of, like, allegedly left-leaning individuals setting fire to Teslas.
Oh, really?
And then, like, spray painting swastikas on them.
That's bizarre.
I know, right? It's like, what's going on here?
Yeah, like you would think those two things would, like, not go together.
Right, so it makes you think, like, what is really driving these, like, seemingly illogical actions? Exactly, what's the underlying motivation there?
Yeah, and they kind of delve into this idea of the power of narratives.
Oh, okay.
Like compelling stories that can be so influential that they motivate people to act.
Yeah, yeah.
Even in ways that might seem counter to their own interests or stated beliefs.
It's like people get caught up in the story.
Yeah.
And they're not even thinking straight.
That makes you wonder, like, how much agency do people really have?
Right. Are they really thinking for themselves?
Yeah. Are they really making these decisions based on, like, their own critical thinking?
Or are they just being manipulated?
Yeah. And they also put this in the context of, like, the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests, reminding us that, like, significant periods of unrest are not entirely new.
Right. It's not like this is the first time we've seen this kind of thing.
Exactly. So it's not like, oh, this is completely unprecedented,
Yeah. But it does seem like there's something different going on now.
Yeah. And that's where they bring up this idea of a protest machine.
A protest machine.
Yeah. Like the idea that some protest movements might not be entirely organic.
Interesting.
Like they raise the possibility of like orchestration.
Orchestration as in like someone's behind it.
Yeah, like someone's pulling the strings.
Oh, okay.
And they often link that to like financial incentives.
Like people are getting paid to protest.
Well, they mention some examples, whether they're anecdotal or factual, who knows,
Sure.
of people supposedly getting paid to attend rallies. Like they cited figures like $400 for a Kamala Harris event.
Really?
Or even like $1,000 for protesting Tesla.
Wow, okay.
Now, whether those specific numbers are accurate or not, the core idea is that there's potential for financial influence in shaping public demonstrations.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Like, it's not always just, people spontaneously coming together.
It's like someone's trying to create a certain narrative.
Exactly, and that's where they bring up this idea of, like, a CIA deep state game.
Oh, boy, here we go.
I know, right? But it's interesting.
I'm listening.
So they use the example of the Maidan revolution in Ukraine.
Okay.
And their point isn't to, like, dismiss the agency of the Ukrainian people seeking change.
Right.
But they highlight the significant U.S. financial investment.
How much are we talking about?
They mentioned a reported $100 million.
Wow, that's a lot of money.
Yeah, and they're saying, like, that kind of funding can provide the infrastructure and resources to, like, sustain protests over an extended period.
Especially in, like, tough conditions like winter.
Exactly. Like, they talked about, like, heat lamps and, even concerts and stuff.
So it's not just about the money itself.
Right.
It's about what that money can buy.
Yeah, like the ability to keep the momentum going.
Keep people motivated.
Exactly.
Right, sure, yeah.
So it's about, like, the interplay between, genuine local desire for change
Right.
and the potential for, like, these significant external actors to shape and amplify these movements through substantial financial support.
It's like a feedback loop.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
complicated, right?
It is.
Okay, so then they shift gears a little bit.
Okay.
And they start talking about this Time magazine article that discussed the secret history of the shadow campaign that saved the 2020 election.
Oh.
Now, the way they interpret this article is, like, key here.
Right. I'm curious.
They're not focused on, like, debunked ballot conspiracy theories or anything like that.
Right.
They're more interested in what they see as the article's own admissions about the actions taken leading up to the election.
Okay, so what kind of actions are we talking about?
Well, they specifically highlight reported instances of censorship on social media platforms.
Censorship.
Yeah, and also a degree of support within certain circles for the riots and protests that happened.
That's interesting.
So it kind of connects back to that protest machine idea,
I see, yeah.
but it adds another layer, like the potential for coordination and influence, not just on the ground, in the streets.
But also online.
Yeah, like within media and technology platforms.
Shaping the narrative.
Exactly.
That's a bit concerning.
And then they bring in, like, the work of figures like Mike Benz and Scott Horton.
Okay.
The point about USI, as discussed by Benz, and Horton's book Provoked, which looks at the history leading up to the war in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Both kind of point to this idea of, like, significant U.S. funding and influence in various, geopolitical areas.
Right.
They even mention this, like, school bus analogy.
School bus analogy.
Yeah, like the idea that seemingly innocuous programs or organizations can sometimes serve as a cover for activities with more strategic and less transparent aims.
Oh, I see, like a front.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's all about, like, plausible deniability.
Plausible deniability.
Yeah, they talk about how NGOs, like those associated with George Soros,
Right.
can be used as a way to exert influence without, like, direct governmental fingerprints.
Interesting.
And while the funding involved might seem like a small fraction of, like, the overall U.S. budget, it's important to recognize that, in smaller countries like Ukraine, sustained investments of billions of dollars can have a huge political impact.
Right. Especially when you compare it to, like, the country's overall GDP.
Exactly.
So it's all relative.
Exactly. All right. So moving into U.S. foreign policy,
Okay.
they bring up what they call the Mike Baker perspective.
Okay.
And the core of this viewpoint is that, like, the U.S. engages with various regimes.
Even like authoritarian ones.
Yeah, even those considered authoritarian.
Yeah.
And seeks to exert influence globally as a way to prevent, like, rivals like China and Russia from filling those vacuums.
So it's like a preemptive kind of thing.
Yeah, like a strategic, power-based rationale for intervention.
Okay, I can see that.
But then, they immediately follow that with, like, a pretty stark counter-argument.
Oh, okay.
And this is important.
Yeah, let's hear it.
They highlight the significant negative consequences of U.S. interventionism over the past 25 years.
Like what?
Well, they cite some pretty sobering statistics,
Oh.
like estimated 4 to 5 million civilian deaths,
Wow.
destabilization of entire regions, trillions of dollars spent.
Trillions.
Yeah, and the tragic impact on U.S. veterans, like the suicide rates and PTSD and all of that.
Right. The human cost.
Exactly. So it makes you question, like, what is the true cost benefit of this approach to foreign policy?
It's a tough question.
Yeah, and they touch on this concept of the unfalsifiable counterfactual.
The unfalsifiable
Yeah,
counterfactual.
it's like, the idea that things would have been worse if we hadn't intervened.
Right, right.
It's hard to argue with because you can't prove or disprove what might have happened.
Exactly. It's all hypothetical.
But we are left with the very real consequences of the interventions that did occur.
And those consequences are often pretty bad.
Yeah, and then there's the practical matter of, like, sustainability.
Sustainability.
Yeah, like with the U.S. national debt now at, like, crazy levels.
Oh, right. Yeah, we can't just keep spending money like this forever.
Exactly. And then they bring up this whole Wesley Clark thing.
Wesley Clark thing. What's that?
So they're referring to this alleged plan, reportedly seen in late 2001,
Okay.
for the U.S. to target 7 countries in a 5-year time frame.
7 countries in 5 years. That's ambitious.
Right. And the crazy thing is, like, a majority of those countries have been involved in conflict since then.
Wow, really?
Yeah, but then they take it a step further.
Okay.
They claim that these strategic considerations might go back even further.
Like how far back?
potentially to 1991 with figures like Paul Wolfowitz.
Wow, okay.
And then, it kind of gets revisited and gains traction later.
With who?
Through a study allegedly funded by Israeli sources.
Israeli sources.
Yeah, and the stated aim was protecting Israel's interests.
That's a pretty big claim.
It is, right.
But like a long-term strategy.
Yeah, and it suggests a deeper motivation behind U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East.
Then meets the eye.
Exactly, so it's a lot to unpack there.
It is.
All right, so now we get into some current geopolitical tensions. They talk about these reports of a potential imminent Israeli strike on Iran.
Oh, wow.
And also this leaked signal chat.
A leaked signal chat?
Yeah, among high-level U.S. government officials.
About what?
About potential military action.
Oh, okay.
And get this, a journalist was included in these discussions.
A journalist?
Yeah, which is kind of crazy, right?
It is, yeah. It raises questions about transparency.
Right, and the potential for, blurring of lines between media and government.
Exactly. Are they reporting the news or making the news?
Yeah, and then the actual content of the chat is, really noteworthy.
Okay, what were they saying?
So the idea being floated was a potential bombing of Yemen.
Yemen?
Yeah, which is one of the poorest countries in the Middle East.
Right.
And seemingly on behalf of Israel in response to the conflict in Gaza.
So they're getting involved in someone else's fight.
It seems that way. And then there's this disturbing detail about tracking a target to his girlfriend's apartment building.
Oh.
And, a lack of significant concern for potential civilian casualties.
That's really concerning.
Yeah, and then they contrast that with J.D. Vance's reported pushback.
J.D. Vance?
Yeah, he's a senator now,
Oh, right.
And he was apparently focusing more on, the importance of European shipping lanes.
Oh, okay, so more of a strategic concern.
Exactly.
Say.
And then they mention Tulsi Gabbard's reported positive reaction to this scenario, which is kind of surprising.
Why is surprising?
Well, because of her past criticisms of interventionist foreign policy.
Oh, right, I see.
So it just shows how complex these discussions can be.
Yeah, it's not always clear-cut.
And then they bring in the historical context of, U.S. involvement in Yemen.
Okay.
Going back to the Obama administration's drone program.
Right.
And then the Saudi-led war and blockade.
Yeah.
And they even reference someone describing it as a goddamn genocide.
Wow, that's strong language.
Yeah, but it just shows how devastating that conflict has been. And they contrast the potential current bombing campaign with, the prospect of a ground invasion.
Which would be a whole other thing.
Right. Way more complex and politically challenging.
For sure.
And then they bring up the fact that even Trump, who's usually pretty hawkish on foreign policy, had previously criticized Biden's actions in bombing the Houthis.
Really?
Yeah, and advocated for diplomatic solutions.
Interesting.
And they mentioned this ceasefire agreement that was negotiated by Trump's envoy.
Okay.
But then it broke down and the attacks resumed.
So it seems like there's no easy answers here.
No, it's really complicated.
It is.
Okay, so then they tell this remarkable anecdote about a White House press briefing.
Oh, okay.
Where the spokesperson, get this, couldn't even acknowledge the existence of the U.S. drone program.
They couldn't acknowledge it.
Nope, even though it was widely reported in the media.
That's kind of crazy.
I know, right?
So it's like they're denying something that everyone already knows about.
Exactly, and they argue that, this kind of thing erodes public trust.
Yeah, for sure.
Because it's if they're lying about this, what else are they lying about?
Right, exactly.
And they point at the irony of people who may have been complicit in concealing information about these so-called secret wars, now expressing concern about threats to democratic principles.
Oh, wow, that is ironic.
Right.
Yeah, it's where were you before?
Exactly.
When all this was happening?
Yeah, and they also highlight the contrast between Obama's image as a peace-oriented candidate.
Right.
And the reality of his administration, initiating and expanding the drone campaign.
Yeah, it's a bit of a disconnect there.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so what's next?
So then they shift the focus to the Israel-Palestine conflict.
That's always a tough one.
It is, and they acknowledge the long history of violence directed at Israelis.
Sure.
But they also present the perspective that, when a population feels systematically oppressed over a long period of time, resistance, both violent and nonviolent, is almost inevitable.
People are going to fight back.
Exactly. And even nonviolent forms of resistance are often met with suppression.
Yeah, unfortunately.
It's a really complex dynamic.
It is. It's hard to know whose side to be on.
Right. And then they bring up Trump's statement of, we're going to take it.
We're going to take it.
Yeah, referring to the conflict and kind of envisioning the region as the Mediterranean of the Middle East.
That's a very assertive approach.
Yeah, and it kind of like, leads into this concern about the reported increase in anti-Semitism globally.
Oh, right. That's a big issue.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder, is this a genuine increase in hateful sentiment?
Right?
Or is it partly that people feel more emboldened to express these views now?
Or maybe a combination of both.
Yeah, it's hard to say.
It is.
And they also touch on this idea of a troll aspect.
A troll aspect.
Yeah, like where some expressions of hate might be intended to provoke reactions.
Oh, right, to get a rise out of people.
Exactly.
So it's like they're not even really anti-Semitic.
Maybe, maybe not. It's hard to know their true intentions, and then they explore this idea of a potential backlash from, like, younger individuals.
Younger individuals.
Yeah, particularly young white men who came of age in a, in a cultural landscape often described as woke,
Right.
where they might have felt unfairly criticized or marginalized.
I can see that.
And they also acknowledge the significant increase in anti-Jewish sentiment, specifically since the recent Gaza conflict.
Okay.
And, like, even within circles on the left,
Oh, no.
where it was previously less openly expressed.
So it's not just coming from the right.
No, it's coming from all sides.
That's concerning.
Yeah. And then they talk about these reports of, like, organized and disruptive protests, vandalism, threats happening on university campuses,
Oh, wow.
which is, concerning.
It is, yeah. Especially on college campuses. You would think that would be a place for open dialogue.
You would think so, right?
Yeah.
And they touch on the divisions within the left regarding support for Israel versus Palestine
Right.
and point out that this is not a new fault line.
No, it's been going on for a long time.
They even reference historical examples of solidarity between groups like the Black Panthers and the Nation of Islam with the Palestinian cause.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so it's a complex issue.
It is.
And then they share this anecdote about a Jewish graduate student at Columbia University
Okay.
who found the protests annoying but didn't feel physically threatened.
Okay.
So it's like a different perspective.
Right.
And then they mention a Passover Seder service organized by some of the protesters.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so it just shows how complex these demonstrations can be.
Yeah, it's not just one monolithic group.
Right, and then they ask this key question:
What's that?
what are the primary motivations of those involved in these protests?
Right. Like, are they genuinely concerned about the Palestinian people?
Yeah.
Or is there some underlying anti-Jewish sentiment at play?
Exactly.
Hard to know.
Yeah, and then they draw this parallel between, the U.S. drone war potentially fueling the growth of groups like al-Qaeda
Okay.
and the idea that the Gaza conflict could be contributing to a rise in anti-Semitism.
So it's like these actions have unintended consequences.
Exactly. And they also bring up the continued U.S. financial and military support for the conflict
Right.
and the perceived reluctance of the U.S. political establishment to openly criticize the Israeli government.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
It is. Okay, so then they talk about Benjamin Netanyahu's track record of predicting Iran's nuclear capabilities and his past recommendations for regime change in the Middle East.
Right.
And the outcomes of some of those interventions, like the toppling of Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi, which didn't exactly lead to, flourishing democracies.
Yeah, it's not like things got better after those interventions.
Right. So it makes you question the unintended consequences of these actions.
Absolutely.
And they give a brief explanation of the Sunni-Shia divide within Islam, which helps provide context for the complexities of the region
Right.
and how, like, removing certain leaders can destabilize things.
It's like a house of cards.
Yeah, and then they question this seemingly automatic support for all wars by some Christian groups,
Interesting.
which seems to contradict, the teachings of peace associated with Jesus.
Yeah, it's a bit of a contradiction.
They acknowledge the counter-argument that wars can be necessary for protection, but then they revisit the intervention in Libya as one of the 7 countries mentioned earlier.
Oh, right.
And they draw this contrast between, what they claim were the positive aspects of Libya under Gaddafi.
Like what?
Things like no-interest loans, infrastructure development, relative peace,
Yeah.
and then the post-intervention reality of a failed state with slave auctions and contributing to the European migrant crisis.
Yeah, it's a pretty stark contrast.
It is. And then they kind of broaden the discussion to how periods of civil unrest can be used as justification for implementing measures that erode civil liberties.
Oh, like what kind of measures?
Things like stricter gun control
Right.
or limitations on the right to protest.
Interesting.
And they even bring up this disturbing suggestion that some actors might intentionally release criminals to create a climate of fear.
Wow, that's a conspiracy theory, right?
Maybe, maybe not. It's hard to say,
Yeah,
but it's something to be aware of.
it is.
And they give examples of arrests in the UK for social media posts critical of the Palestinian flag.
Really?
Yeah, so it's like free speech is being curtailed.
That's scary.
Yeah, and they reference Harry Brown's analogy of the government breaking your leg and then offering you a crutch.
Oh, I like that
It's a
analogy.
good one, right?
Yeah, it's like they create the problem and then offer the solution.
Exactly. And then they use the example of the initial widespread condemnation of the George Floyd video,
Right.
followed by calls for military intervention to quell the riots,
Oh, yeah.
to show how public opinion can be swayed towards greater government control in response to unrest.
Yeah, it's like people are willing to give up their freedom for security.
Right. And they even mention the argument that the government might have allowed the riots to continue for certain purposes.
Wow, that's cynical.
It is, but it's something to think about.
It is.
Okay, so then they focus specifically on the George Floyd incident.
Okay.
And they raise the question of whether this event, viewed solely through the initial details of a counterfeit $20 bill,
Right.
would have garnered the same level of national and international attention
Good question.
and become such a significant racial flashpoint.
Yeah, it's hard to say.
They compare it to the Rodney King case,
Oh, yeah.
highlighting the novelty and brutality captured on video in the Floyd case.
Right. The video really made a difference.
Yeah, it amplified the impact.
For sure.
And they note the absence of overtly racial slurs during the incident
Okay.
and question whether a similar event involving a white individual might have unfolded in the same way.
That's a tough one.
It is, but they also acknowledge the racial dynamic.
Of a white police officer kneeling on a black man's neck.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's hard to ignore.
And they point out the involvement and subsequent prosecution of officers of various racial backgrounds.
Right.
And they briefly mention the potential contributing factor of fentanyl.
Okay.
And then they contrast the intense media coverage of the Floyd incident with what they suggest is often less extensive coverage of other instances of alleged police misconduct.
Right. It's like some cases get more attention than others.
Exactly. And then they share an anecdote about a baseball player's analogy for the constant vigilance and potential for errors in certain professions,
Okay.
perhaps drawing a parallel to policing.
I see.
But they return to this fundamental principle,
What's that?
the question of necessity.
The necessity.
Yeah, do you absolutely have to do this?
Oh, right.
Whether it's a police action or a foreign policy decision.
Okay.
And they use the example of Eric Garner and the loose cigarettes.
Oh, yeah, that was a tragic case.
It was.
Okay, so what else did they talk about?
So then they move on to immigration policy,
Right.
and they discuss the kids in cages controversy during Trump's first term.
Right.
But they make sure to note that similar facilities and policies were in place during the Obama administration.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so it highlights the role of media narratives in shaping public perception.
Yeah, like how the same thing can be spun differently depending on who's in power.
Exactly.
Interesting.
And they use the example of the civil rights movement in Birmingham
Okay.
to show how visual media can powerfully shift public opinion on moral and ethical matters.
Right, like those images from Birmingham really changed people's minds about segregation.
Exactly. And then they characterize the Biden administration's immigration policies as surprisingly restrictive,
Oh, wow.
arguing that they've actually shifted the country's stance on immigration further to the right than many expected.
That's unexpected.
Yeah, and while they acknowledge that a lot of people might support mass deportations in theory, they raise the point about the difference between abstract support and witnessing the reality of it.
Oh, I see.
They use the example of the large prison facility in El Salvador.
Right, it's different when you see the human cost.
Exactly, and then they bring up quotas in law enforcement.
Quotas?
Yeah, like using speeding tickets as an example,
Yeah.
and how those performance metrics can influence priorities and behavior.
Oh, right, like cops might be more likely to give tickets if they have a quota to meet.
Yeah, and they share this anecdote about the NYPD slowdown in arrests for minor offenses after the controversy surrounding stop and frisk.
Stop and frisk.
Yeah, where they were stopping and searching people on the street.
Oh.
And they note that focusing primarily on violent crime didn't lead to an increase in violence,
Interesting.
but it did significantly impact the revenue generated from minor infractions.
So it's like they were policing for profit.
Exactly.
That's a problem.
Yeah, and they also critique the regressive nature of traffic tickets, which disproportionately affect lower-income individuals.
Right, because those fines can really add up.
Yeah, especially if you can't afford to pay them.
Absolutely.
All right, so then they switch gears again and start talking about cultural shifts and political polarization.
Okay.
And they discuss the browning of America demographic trend,
Right.
which was initially often presented positively by Democrats.
Okay.
But then objections to rapid demographic change were subsequently framed negatively as the Great Replacement theory, which
Oh,
became a big point of contention.
yeah, it's a very sensitive topic.
It is, and they point out the attempt by some to label voter ID requirements as inherently racist.
Voter ID?
Yeah, but then they contrast that with the recent implementation of mandatory COVID vaccine IDs,
Oh, I see.
which they see as a logical inconsistency.
Yeah, it's like, you need an ID for this, but not for that.
Exactly, and they cite Kathy Hochul's comment about Black inner-city kids not knowing what computers are
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
as an example of what they call bigotry of low expectations.
Right, it's like they're assuming that minority groups are somehow less capable.
Exactly, and they argue that these inconsistencies have contributed to a shift in public opinion against current levels of immigration.
Okay.
And they also note that Trump won a larger percentage of the Latino vote in recent elections.
Really?
Yeah, which is interesting.
It is. It kind of goes against the conventional wisdom.
It does, and then they introduce this concept of imposing white lady values on minority groups.
White lady values.
Yeah, like they use humor as an example,
Yes.
suggesting that some liberals might be more easily offended by certain jokes or language than some individuals from minority backgrounds.
Oh, right, like they're trying to speak for them.
Exactly.
That's patronizing.
It is, and they also note the intense criticism often directed at Black Republicans.
Oh, yeah, they often get accused of being Uncle Toms or sellouts.
Right, and